everybody, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Taylor and I am so excited to talk all things Agatha all along. Before we get into this spoiler review, I am going to ask you to please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and while you're at it, go ahead and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video here on Critical Commentary. Wow, I'm actually going to have something positive to say about Marvel. I'm just joking. I normally have positive things to say. I just don't think I've really ever done a video before. So this is going to be really interesting. I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a spoiler-free review for those who haven't seen the show yet, considering the fact that there's a little bit of like a lag in the audience buildup. But I also really wanted to get into some of the spoiler stuff that happened because this show is so good. I really enjoyed like She-Hulk. I enjoyed certain aspects of Phase 4, but to be honest with you, Phase 4 was just like unceremoniously ended because it wasn't doing very well. And now that we're kind of in Phase 5 and things are a little bit all over the place with like reworking projects, I just really was curious to see like what was going to be released. I know that in my Gen V video, I had a low amount of faith and, you know, I still kind of maintain a little bit of that sentiment, and I'm so glad that I kind of was proven wrong, at least on the WandaVerse level of the MCU, because Multiverse of Madness was not my movie. I actually saw that in theaters and I had a lot of problems with it. I'll try to leave some timestamps on the screen so that you can avoid spoilers if that's something that you want. Let's get into it. The series picks up 3 years after the events of WandaVision. Agatha believes herself to be a detective in some Gillian Flynn HBO looking kind of Mayor of Easttown series, which checks considering the fact that this is still Wanda's spell and this is technically Agatha's punishment for all the chaos that she ensued. While under this spell, Agnes is on a case where they happen to find a Jane Doe out in the woods near Westview. I guess to kind of put Agatha all along on the timeline, it seems like it's a little bit tangentially occurring right after the events of Multiverse of Madness, because this Jane Doe is highly implied to be that of Wanda Maximoff. However, because Agatha is still under the spell, she doesn't realize that it's Wanda, and so she's like obsessed about solving this case. Because this case is getting super intense, the Westview department end up bringing in the feds, and we are met with Agent Rio Vidal, who for some reason makes Agnes really uncomfortable. Agnes is unable to get her mind off of the Jane Doe when that evening, after talking to Vidal, realizes that someone's breaking into her home. She discovers that this break-in is caused by a teenage boy who she for some reason connects to the Jane Doe that she found that morning. While she's trying to interrogate this teenager, he starts speaking magic, and next thing she knows, she realizes that she's in a spell and is successfully able to break herself free from it. However, two things remain intact: Rio Vidal and the teenager.
I've missed you. I hate you.
Rio Vidal is some sort of assassin, I guess, who very much wants to unalive Agatha. And because she knows that she's not at her full power yet, she tells Rio to give her a chance to juice back up, get her purple back, as she says. Rio allows her to do so, but not without marking her with what I honestly interpreted as the black spot. She also again realizes that she has somehow kidnapped this teenage boy who is now in her closet, and because he is able to wield magic and talks about magic, he tells her, hey, please come with me on the witch's road. He's able to convince her because she knows, just like he does, the song tells of wealth and riches. But no one's been on the road and survived, except, well, Agatha. Agatha and Teenager realize that the only way that they can get on this road is by summoning a coven. So they gather this ragtag group of witches consisting of a divination witch who is Lilia Caldero, played by Patti LuPone, a potions master named Jennifer Kale, who is played by Sashir Zamata, and a protection witch in the form of Alice Wu Gulliver, who is played by Ali On. All of these witches seem a little bit weary of Agatha because they are all aware of her reputation, but they decide to go on this road anyways. And they are successful in actually opening the door, albeit with some complications because, like I said, Rio marked Agatha with the black spot, and this kind of puts a little bit of a supernatural timeline on the coven because Rio has sent the Salem Seven, a hive mind group of witches hell-bent on unaliving Agatha and tormenting Agatha. Once on the road, the coven are to complete 5 trials set before them. Each witch is featured in each trial and tasked to overcome their trauma as well as work together to solve each riddle before the timer runs out. As the coven proceeds with each task, their relationship with themselves as well as each other are heavily tested. They begin to let their walls down and build intimate relationships that is half trauma bond and half sisterhood. However, even though they build this tight relationship, the trials don't go in the way that they hope. When I first saw the show being dropped, I kind of hesitated in tuning in. I'm not gonna lie, I actually waited for the show to completely finish before I started because I wanted to be able to binge it, mostly because I had a feeling I wanted to review the series, and also because when I was doing research and preparation for this video, all I kept seeing was kind of this like negative narrative around Agatha all along, and I just couldn't understand why. Variety was saying that the show only hit about 9.3 million viewers in its first week. It's one of the 3rd lowest MCU shows on the Disney Plus platform, especially because, you know, when you look at the Rotten Tomatoes scores as well, it's one of the lower Rotten Tomatoes scores. And at the time of the writing of the Forbes article that shows the low Rotten Tomatoes score, that was at the beginning of the series. I know that at this point it is now sitting a little bit more comfortably in, I believe, the lower 80s. And I think that that is probably a little bit more accurate in relation to how well this show is probably being received. Because to be honest, a lot of the love is not coming from critics. It's coming from audiences, and it's coming from the internet.
For the internet, this is for the YouTube, for all the baby hags out there.
Who we say hi to?
The internet, the internet, the internet. This is for the internet.
When I say that this show is for
the girls, the gays, the non-binary bays, the trans hotties, the asexual baddies, and the bisexuals who always lose a sock when doing laundry.
I mean it. I felt so seen in this series. There's so much about this show that people can pull from. It doesn't necessarily have to be from the central love story that I think sent right-wing media all in a tizzy. You get into the symbolic nature of the relationship, it is so much more than a woke series. It is a show about grief. It's about love. It's about friendship and loss of community. And I think that is why this show, while getting a little bit of a late start, is starting to build the cult following that I truly think it deserves. At this point, I will kind of say that if you have not seen the show, to maybe go ahead and clock out, because I do really want to get into the analysis portion of this series, and that's going to involve kind of getting into a lot of the plot. So again, if you have not seen this show and you don't mind me spoiling it for you, stay tuned. But for those who want to bow out, I will see you in the next one. Bye. I'm going to talk a little bit out of order when we get into some of the trials. I hope that it makes sense once we get a little bit further into the video. So go along on this journey with me. I found it really cool that the second trial was a place that Alice remembered rather than it being a idea of a place that the rest of the coven kind of recognized just from pop culture and film. Once the coven reaches the second trial, Alice is super hesitant to go inside because she knows that this home is the, I guess, green room of her mother when her mother would go on tour. And it seems like this is the place where her mother passed because of a fire. Like I said earlier, the point of these trials is to highlight each witch as well as the coven as a whole. They're supposed to be a little bit like musketeers in this all for one and one for all kind of mindset. And at this point, it's starting to feel a little bit confusing in terms of just like what the full rules are, because again, this is still very early on. That's why I decided to name this chapter The Knight of Wands. I found Lilia Caldero's tarot readings and the roles that she put each member of the coven in to be really significant, which is why I wanted to, one, do this analysis, but also why I've decided to break this story up the way I did. Lilia Caldero describes Alice as the Knight of Wands, one, because she is a protection witch, which would describe the knight aspect of her role in the coven, and also the Knight of Wands because the element that is associated with the suit of wands is fire. So I felt like that was a really appropriate tarot reading for Alice. I also liked that because Alice is kind of giving a little bit of this like androgynous vibe with her haircut. I kind of felt like having her be the knight versus the queen or king of wands was also just kind of a little bit of a nod. And like I said before, because this series is very queer and open about it in its own little way, again, this is Disney, so it can't get but so open, but I will say this is probably the most open I've seen Disney be, especially considering the fact that Disney does have a conservative audience. So it's interesting to see that they would actually play to this element. But again, I don't know if that's also because they just didn't expect the series to do as well as it's doing, or didn't expect the series to take on the following that it did. But, you know, I'm not mad at it. While in the second trial, Alice is forced to come to terms with why she's been super down in her luck. And unfortunately, she does so by dragging the rest of the coven into her generational curse. We don't really get a lot of information about this, but for some reason, Alice's family has been plagued with a generational curse that affects each woman. That's also why she is a blood witch. I thought it was kind of interesting that the demon slash curse was like this manifestation of, I couldn't tell if it was like a harpy, because they end up actually having to sing the Witch's Road song, but Alice's mother's version as a way of counteracting the curse. So I found that to be kind of cool that they did like a music to sound kind of like counteracting, but I also just love that they threw a music number in here, because I think at this point, by the time we were listening to them play this version of the Witch's Road, I feel like I had the whole song memorized and I was jamming out with the rest of the coven. It was such a good scene. I loved it, but also I really loved seeing Alice's ability to break that curse with the support and love of that coven. It was at that point where the coven started to actually come together and work together, especially after their failure and snafu with the first trial.
She has a name. It's Mrs. Hart.
I think that's what made the later parts of what happened to Alice just so painful, because at this moment, you know, we're seeing her break the curse finally, and she feels so much lighter, and she even describes feeling lighter multiple times in that trial. And to see it get cut short because of Agatha is just such a gut-wrenching moment, because I think at this point we are looking at how Alice is what I described as the everyday aspects of magic. She was kind of, I felt like, symbolic of camaraderie, sisterhood, and connection. She seemed to be the only person who was already in community with witches prior because of that familial connection. But because her family was ravished by this curse, she was alone. And that's why she found a coven that would accept her. And so I just found that to be such a beautiful and like lovely part to her story. But I also think that that is what hurt so much, was when it got cut short, you somehow already felt very connected to her in such a short amount of time. When I saw Lilia's reading of Jennifer as the High Priestess, I very much felt so in love with that role that Lilia had given her, especially considering how heartbreaking I think Jennifer's story is. Jennifer Kale, prior to going on the road, is a beauty influencer. Seems like she has a skincare line, but is in the process of dealing with some legal battles after being called a fraud, after it seems like there are some skin allergic reactions and complaints from her customers. One of the reasons why she is kind of doing this is because she's bound. And that's why I found the High Priestess to be such a cool role for her to be in, because we shortly find out that throughout these trials that Jennifer is kind of like a secret MVP. She has so much knowledge and is able to be such a huge support system for other people throughout the trials.
Counterclockwise.
To the left. Right. It's like a blue-green, maybe like a teal.
It's green, teen.
After Alice is successful in completing the second trial, while the rest of the witches are kind of getting to know each other, we learn a little bit more about Jennifer's backstory. Jennifer admits that she actually doesn't identify as a witch. She identifies as a root worker and a midwife. And that is kind of how she was bound. She was invited to Boston to give a speech on midwifery and was tricked into this subjugation that I honestly feel, based off of some of the shots, angles, and language that's used, that it's heavily implied that something a little bit more sinister happens, and that this being bound aspect is an allegory for that more sinister event. I'm curious to know if other people saw this that way. I was a little bit hesitant on adding that into my analysis, but for some reason, I feel like when I watched it the first time, it initially stuck with me, and it was something that was really hard for me to kind of let go in my later viewings. And so I'm curious to know your thoughts if you're, if you saw something a little bit differently. There are also a lot of moments where I notice when Lilia becomes like very culturally offended, that Jennifer kind of steps in to be this like voice of, I don't want to say reason. It's not that she kind of placates Lilia, but I did feel like it was with Jennifer's storyline that we kind of realized that, and I also saw this on TikTok, that, the bad guy really is Wicca. I know that that's a little bit of a really harsh thing to say. It's critiquing the concept of religion that is taken from other cultures, colonialized, imperialized, whitewashed, and then kind of repackaged to look differently, when in reality it's just remnants of what was stolen. And so I think that that might be kind of more so what that critique was, how in a way witchcraft, the craft in general, or how we see witchcraft, it is this like romanticization of other people's actual religion and culture. And so how something that is sacred is kind of twisted and used in a way that, yes, can be empowering for women, but at the same time be culturally appropriative and insensitive. And I again, this could be me reaching, but I found the fact that, near the end, when Jennifer realizes that it is Agatha who bound her all along because she was selling like dime binds.
What are you doing?
Randomly, because she was just doing it, I guess, for survival. But when Jennifer realizes that it was Agatha that bound her and she completes her unbinding ritual, she rightfully leaves.
Hold nothing. You hold nothing. You hold nothing. You hold nothing. You hold nothing.
Her storyline to just be really significant. It was about this regaining of power, this regaining of the self and of one's individuality, especially after experiencing a severe trauma that leaves you feeling powerless. I'm also curious to see if we get a little bit more backstory, considering the fact that there was, I think, some teases that maybe she might return. I really love the fact that Lilia gave her the High Priestess card, because the High Priestess is a card of divine femininity. And I also loved that Jennifer Kale was one of the most hyper femininely dressed characters in the Coven. I loved that. I thought that was kind of insane. I mean, they gave her braces. They also made her, I believe, the hag version of the evil witch from Snow White in the fourth trial. But like, other than that, you notice that like she's always very hyper femininely costumed and draped, and I thought that was really on point, because she seems to be the more like zen witch, especially that's how she like presents herself on social media. And so I really loved that. I also thought there was a little bit of a nod to the love witch. So when getting ready for this video, I did find that it seemed like Forbes wanted to take back some of the things that they said about the third worst rated series once they saw episode 7. Episode 7 is such an interesting episode, mostly because it plays with time and it plays with a lot of the editing choices that were kind of filtered out throughout the entire season up until this point. And that's kind of why I've been kind of talking a little bit anachronistically about the trials, because once I got here, I knew that it would kind of all make more sense. That's Hand in Mind comes right at the turning point of the season. Right before this, we have pretty much watched the Coven crumble. In the first trial, the coven accidentally unalives Mrs. Hart.
Who's Sharon?
You done lost your damn mind.
And they forget that she's chilling on the table because she's been poisoned and have to substitute a new green witch and end up getting Rio Vidal. During the third trial, which is rightfully Agatha's trial, and they have to go and play with the Ouija board to make contact with the spirits, and Agatha is possessed by her toxic, narcissistic mother. The coven is stripped of their protection, which when Alice boldly tries to save Agatha and ends up accidentally unaliving herself because she activates Agatha's magical ability of absorption. I haven't really gotten into this at this point, but Agatha has a very similar power to that of Rogue, except instead of stealing your power because of physical touch, if you were to blast your power at Agatha Harkness, she is able to kind of use it as a life force and like harness it from you completely. And so that's where she gains a lot of her power. Agatha is usually at the center of almost every trial and tribulation that the coven encounters on this road. They even have to fly away on Hexenbexen to avoid the Salem 7 because the Salem 7 is still after Agatha because of her black spot. So by the time we get to this episode, Lilia and Jennifer are feeling very underappreciated because two witches are gone. And now they're stuck with Rio, who seems to be on her own quest while on this road with the rest of the coven. And Agatha is just honestly being so chaotic and erratic. You can also tell that she's starting to get very, very suspicious of Teenager, who has a sigil making it difficult for them to know his name, hence why they're calling him Teen or Teenager. And he is, at this point, angry with Agatha because he and Alice had started to build a connection together as he's starting to build connection with all the other witches. And he attacks all three of them, burying them. And this sets off a chain of events. We are eventually invited to Teenager's account of the events that happened prior to him meeting Agatha. And it seems like Teenager is a boy named William Kaplan from Eastview. William Kaplan is having his bar mitzvah when something weird is going on in the town next door. It seems like everyone's aware of the hexagonal anomaly, so it seems like they were aware that WandaVision was occurring at the time that the bar mitzvah, I guess, is being prepped and planned. But for some reason now it's starting to go down, and this is sending chaos. William and his family tried to evacuate the bar mitzvah and get home before the anomaly collapses, but get into an accident and hit a tree on William's side of the car. It seems like William's injuries might be fatal, which is very scary, but it seems like because at the same time that the anomaly is shrinking, that Billy is able to leave the hexagon and possess the body of William Kaplan. He still retains his memories though and lived the next 3 years as William, but he's able to hear voices now and again has memories of Tommy and is trying to find him. This is how we end up seeing his version of the events that happened in the pilot episode when he sneaks into Agatha's home in Westview. This is also how we find out about the sigil, because it is at his bar mitzvah that he gets a tarot reading from the one and only Lilia Caldero. Lilia gets a weird vibe from him, and because she doesn't know exactly what's going on, she decides to put a sigil on his jacket to protect him, because she says that he's not totally sure who he is yet, which I think is really interesting considering at the time that she does it, he's William, not really knowing that Billy is going to be in his body moments later. I decided to kind of preface my favorite episode with Billy's story, because I do feel like Billy's story is the catalyst for a lot of what happens with Lilia's episode, and it also ties everything together, because after Billy attacks all of the witches and buries them on the side of the road, for some reason the coven is split into two and have to traverse the road on kind of like opposite planes. Lilia and Jennifer are in this like underground road where they are hiding from the Salem 7 and also kind of looking for a bookcase. Billy and Agatha are able to continue on the road that they were initially on and get to a creepy, haunted, Wizard of Oz looking castle. What made me really love this episode is, I think, the emotion that is carried in the episode. I won't describe it similarly like in a cinematographical way to The Haunting of Hill House. I did feel the same way as the episode of the Two Storms, that is the one-shot episode. There's something about this sense of dread and knowing sadness and the beauty of it as well. As I said, Lilia and Jennifer are kind of forced to travel this underground railroad, it seems, to get to the next trial. And while Jennifer and Lilia are walking and hiding, Lilia is going in and out of her lucidity. This is when we start to see a lot of stuff that was happening earlier in the episodes making sense. For example, the fact that she was able to see who was going to be on the road with them, and the fact that she was able to list the coven. Also, in this first trial, you notice that she is the only person who sees herself, which I think is significant considering she is the time traveler as well as the divination witch. One of the things that Lilia says is that she reads time and she reads people, but she doesn't actually speak to the dead or have any sort of communion with death. And I thought that was a really cool way of setting up maybe where her limitations were, but also why we see the things that we see as she goes through her time gaps. When they are poisoned by the wine, one of the side effects is that they start to hallucinate. Alice sees the fire that took her mother. Jennifer experiences the attack when she was in Boston before she was bound. And like I said, Lilia sees a younger version of herself, but she doesn't just see herself. She also sees the elder of her coven. She sees that a fever comes, and she sees in the hallucination her elder who's already been taken by the fever. But she's not alone. In the darkness, she sees Lady Death. And I thought that was interesting that Lilia is the only person who does actually see death, despite the fact that she does not commune with death. She says that rightfully that responsibility goes to Agatha, hence why the third trial and the Ouija connection with the dead trial is Agatha's to complete. The gaps are starting to bleed. She travels into the body of her younger self and is able to communicate with a now alive elder of her coven. And the elder tries to help guide her in terms of figuring out why she's visiting, why she's seeing the things that she's seeing, so that she can start to understand the story a little less anachronistically and a little bit more linearly. Linearly? maybe. Even though Lilia is going in and out of lucidity on this underground railroad, she's able to get enough lucidity in bursts where she and Jennifer are able to really build a connection with one another. And I think that it was their friendship that I really loved to see the most. Like I said earlier, the Lilia sees in her future the fever that wipes out her coven. And I think that that has something to do with why she ends up being a hermit instead of having a coven. Something that you notice seems to be a little bit of a theme. She's angry with the teacher while she's like visiting and having these conversations in the past. And, you know, she realizes that while she's talking with her teacher, the tarot reading that she is pulling is actually a telling of the events of the witch's road. She sees every single trial, and we start to see that as she's like pulling the cards and seeing the trials and seeing what everything is, she's noticing where these gaps are. Call outs that felt wispy or kooky are now a little bit more in sync with each other. Even though Lilia is not a witch that communes with death, because she foresaw it in the first trial, it is her who realizes that they have been traveling with death all along. Lilia decides to sacrifice herself for the greater good of the coven. She realizes that she is finally in control and is able to save the coven by taking out the Salem Seven whilst also sacrificing herself. When we think about Agatha's reputation, and when we think about the relationship that Rio and Agatha have, this contentious love story that feels a little bit marked by betrayal and lies, the fact that Agatha is a serial unaliver, it would make sense that Agatha would be in love with death. Kind of like the ultimate emo girl. Like if Emily Dickinson was like serious. Oh my gosh. If Emily Dickinson was serious. Oh, please don't cancel me. The reason why Lilia never really was able to, I think, bond as closely with Rio, and the reason why she felt somewhat fearful of Rio is because, like Jennifer said, when Rio manifested on the road after they lost Mrs. Hart,
Sharon.
Rio told everybody exactly who she was. And she meant it. That's why we start to see weird conversations like the conversation between Rio and Agatha in the sound booth during the second trial. The one that Lilia overhears and even says to Rio, "I haven't forgotten about what you said. This is the deal. That's why we're here." Yeah, so Rio is Lady Death, and Thanos is pissed.
Hey, you haven't returned any.
You are gay!
This pretty much makes a lot of sense now that we're seeing why Agatha was so uncomfortable at the beginning, and it also makes sense why in the pilot episode Rio says, you know, I was in the neighborhood. We're here for the Multiverse of Madness and WandaVision. I'm sure you collected, but that's the thing. She kind of didn't. As I said before, when William Kaplan got in the car accident and Billy took over, a soul was not collected. Because Agatha has a long-term reputation of being a serial unaliver, and we kind of get to see why this reputation isn't so much of a lie, it would make sense that Rio would want to stay close to Agatha because she knows that she can collect souls when she's near her. It fuels their relationship. And even though there's not a whole lot of backstory, this is something that I think Jack Schaefer was kind of like not expecting people to really want was a backstory on their relationship. My personal headcanon was that, you know, they built this love of death together. It's appropriate that because of what also breaks them up.
No one in history has had special treatment like you.
You call what you did special treatment. You gave me nothing. You took.
And that's usually your move, right?
Agatha realizes, and not just Agatha, but Billy realizes that this whole road was completely fabricated by Billy. Yeah, so plot twist. Billy created the road. This is why Agatha tells Billy, you know, you have a tell. Because one, pop culture and film TV references are immaculate, you know, chef's kiss. But also the fact that they have to process trauma in a way that becomes very much literal. In episode 9, we see that Agatha is dealing with a really difficult birth. And Rio wants to take this child from Agatha because she knows that it's not viable. Agatha pleads with Death, and Death decides to give her time, doesn't specify on purpose. Agatha tries to extend this time and does so by using her absorption powers to unalive covens of women, with the intent of hoping to keep her son, Nicholas Scratch, alive. But Lady Death comes for us all. Grief-stricken, Agatha is driven mad, which I believe allows her to be easily corruptible by the Darkhold later. She uses the song that her son and her created to lure unsuspecting witches to their doom as a way of acquiring more power. I interpreted this as her buying her own time and defying Lady Death by becoming as close to as immortal as she could, but this tears her away from her humanity as a result. By finding Billy and going on this imaginary adventure with him, Agatha not only successfully protects her pseudo-son from death, but sacrifices herself in his place. She succumbs to death finally, but on her own terms. I think Agatha initially experiences death in a way that's not on her terms. And I think that's what leads her on the path that she ends up on by the time we meet her in WandaVision. Agatha is very much focused on the fact that she has her son and she wants to maintain that time that she can have, so she steals it from others. And it's really sad that, like, as Nicholas gets older and he starts to realize it, he starts to not like it, and he holds Agatha to a higher standard. This is something that I think is also paralleled in her relationship with Billy, because at every single point of the season and at every single point in the trial, Billy is very much there to be both Agatha's cheerleader and also a little bit of a judge. He kind of holds her accountable and says, you're better than this. I know you are. And I think some of this might have something to do with the fact that, you know, he was connected to her from when they were, in the hexagon anomaly together. She kind of is acting so erratically while they're on the road because she's very much aware that Billy has made this road.
They tried me. This is Martin Luther King in the club getting dubs with a bad bitch in his ear saying that she down for whatever. In the back of his mind is Coretta, and she knows, and I know she knows, and I know she knows.
She knows that once Rio is on the road that she's going to be sniffing for Billy's soul, and she doesn't want to give Rio another son. It's also why Rio makes the comments that she makes, and she goes, he's not yours, you can't have him. They're always talking about how this is just a growing boys' fantasy. But Agatha plays along, not just because, I think she lied on her resume, as I saw someone say on TikTok. That was actually very funny. She also does it because of the amount of faith that Billy puts on Agatha. yes, it's pressure, but I also think it's a chance for her to finally prove herself in a way too. And, you know, she even said, you know, it wasn't real until you made it. And I think that even though the trial was fake, it still had a realness to it because so much was taken from each trial. And I think about how Agatha must have felt, especially when she was betrayed by Rio. And it's, you know, and that's the thing, you know, Rio says, like, it was my job, I had to. And that's why Agatha was her scar. I think in a way, Rio might have been her scar too in return. Because I'm sure it's very difficult to see your ex-love take your son somewhere that you can't follow. It's fitting because of her reputation and the fact that she lives up to that reputation afterwards out of grief. But I think what makes more sense, her relationship to death, especially the weirdness there, it's coming from this place of, you let me create life only to take it from me at such a short amount of time. And what is her purpose once a love like that is gone? And not just that romantic love, but that love of the child. I found this series to just ask a lot of questions about not just the human experience, but, you know, if we have to be specific, the female experience or the femme experience. This sense of creating life and watching the cycle of life, you know, be outside of your control is a very scary thing. And I think that's why a lot of the witches chose to hide themselves rather than to lean into their power and to grow. I don't think that this is the only analysis that you take from this series, but I did feel like this was an important aspect of it. And I also found the storyline of death to just be so powerful. And I feel like even now I probably did not or do it justice, because it was just the way that the show kind of like packaged the entire storyline. It was just done super, super well. I do know that some people apparently had issues with the last episode, especially because, you know, in episode 8, we kind of see Agatha kind of come to terms with her relationship with death. But to be honest, I think it ended the way it should have. Agatha realizes that the only way to protect Billy is to balance the natural order by giving up herself. And I found this sacrifice to be interesting and a little bit different, but also similar to that of Lilia's. Found it kind of interesting that those two were also the ones who were tasked with a sacrifice. Lilia sacrificed herself for the coven as a sense of being in control of one's fate. And I guess you could maybe argue that that was the same thing for Agatha, but I found it to be more so she sacrificed herself for love. I'm sure that this was a bit of like a stream of consciousness in terms of a review, but I hope that I kind of really encapsulated like how I felt about this series, because even though it was a bit of a wild ride, I think that's what I enjoyed the most about it. I felt kind of thrown into the world in a way that was a little bit disjointing, because I think I was thinking a lot about a multiverse of madness and just kind of how that film was so bad and just how it ended and just all the continuity issues. Even just as a one-off series, I truly enjoyed watching Agatha all along. I was really looking for something that would take me on a wild ride, and I feel like it did. And I also felt like the story just ended up being so much more beautiful than I expected it to be. And that made me love the show even more. And it made the multiple runs of the show just so much easier to get through, because at that point everything was just starting to make a lot more sense. And I know I said this before, but I can't keep saying again how well Jack Schaefer and the writing team did on this script. It was tighter, it was more concise, and I think because of that, the show was just more enjoyable. And it might also be because I binged this versus watching WandaVision with the weekly model when it was dropping, but I also think that it just really had to do with the fact that Jack Schaefer came back to this world after it got a little bit messed around with, and gave us something beautiful and something to really root for, as well as a love story for the ages, man. Like, oh my gosh, Rio and Agatha ship so hard. The chemistry was so good between Catherine Hahn and Aubrey Plaza. I literally will never not ship them at this point. I really am curious to know what your thoughts are. If you saw this series, if you liked it, how did you feel about my analysis? Did you agree with some of my plot points, some of my themes that I picked up on? Were there some things that I missed and that I didn't see? Were there some Easter eggs that I forgot to mention and plot points that I forgot to really touch upon? Please let me know all of your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Also, make sure to follow me on Letterboxd and Instagram at CriticalCom with 2M's TV. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Bye, everyone.